Next up, we have Professor Sinclair Davidson. He's Professor of Institutional Economics, Finance and Marketing at RMIT in Australia. His research interests includes taxation, public policy, and property rights, and the challenges for development between these things. So let's welcome Professor Sinclair Davidson.
Okay. And that's the button, yeah? I'll turn that on. Okay, so good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to be speaking to a paper that I published with one of my colleagues in the Cato Journal last year, and then applying that to some sort of local conditions and economic policy. So, talking about the future economy, I'm actually going to tell a very techno-optimist story. I can also talk pessimism if you want, but in the time I'm going to talk about optimism. And I'm going to make the argument sort of building on what Rosine said earlier on. The Industrial Revolution was the mobilization of physical capital. And I think as we move into the post-industrial revolution, we're going to see the mobilization of entrepreneurship. And this morning when you heard Rosine talking, he was talking about land, labor, capital. And of course, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurial ability. But unfortunately, economists are not very good, or haven't been very good, at incorporating entrepreneurship and human capital into our stories. And we've always focused on land, labor, capital. Now, my good friend Duncan Reiki always used to say, anything you can dig out of the ground with your fingernails is labor. Everything else is capital. And I'm going to go further and say everything else is actually human capital. And yesterday morning, Andrew in his speech quoted Ayn Rand and from Francisco's money speech. And if you haven't read the money speech, please Google it. You can read just the money speech if you want to. And in there he says, man's mind, or people's mind, I suppose, these days, is actually the source of all the wealth and all the creativity that you see around us. So please read that speech. Anyway, our story is about technology, and the new technologies that we've got now, the sharing economy, the blockchain, all these sorts of things, I believe are going to lead to less human alienation. They're actually going to lead to more interhuman cooperation and interaction along the lines of what Fred was saying, and the sharing economy is actually going to lead to a situation where we're going to have less ownership of stuff and more ownership of ideas, and that's actually quite important. Property rights in my story, I believe, are going to become more important, not less important, and intellectual property rights are going to become even more important because for a large extent, up until now, we haven't been able to define, trade, and fractionalize intellectual property rights, which we will be able to do in future, and as a result, new markets will open up along these lines. But we're at a classical liberal libertarian type conference, and of course, intellectual property rights are controversial in our circles, largely because a lot of people seem to think that intellectual property rights are about government monopoly. I want to tell you it's not about government monopoly per se, it's really about a return to human capital. Now, in the standard economic story, intellectual property rights result because of market failure. Because of this market failure, there's not enough innovation in the economy, and therefore the government steps in to create incentives to produce more intellectual capital, and the government creates a monopoly system, and we see cronyism and all that sort of the bad things. And in this approach, really, people seem to think that not only the government creates the intellectual property right, the government actually creates the intellectual property itself. And in this story, we have benevolent government preventing private theft. Now, if you think about the story for long enough, you realize it's a strange story. There are some very funny ideas in there, because it suggests to us that the biggest problem the world faces are teenagers living in their mums' basements stealing Game of Thrones. Now, that's not quite true. I mean, I don't want to say that there aren't teenagers actually doing this, and not even teenagers themselves. But in actual fact, the biggest problem the world faces is government. Government is more likely to steal IP than the private. Look at the pharmaceuticals industry. Look at plain packaging, we will in a moment, and look at the so-called stateless income argument that's coming out of the OECD, unfortunately been quite successful in recent times. The problem. with this view of the world is that if you truly believe that IP is a gift from the government, you can't complain when the government takes away your gift. And I've actually had lawyers tell me that in Australia. IP is a gift from the government. You got a gift. Now you don't have a gift. What's your problem? But IP is not a gift from the government. If you haven't seen Alan and Elkin's book, University Economics, the Freedom Fund has just republished it as Universal Economics. Please get a copy if you don't already have one. But in there they talk about economic rights. And economic rights is the right to earn an income from an asset you have created. And we know, Ayn Rand told us, assets come from human beings' minds. So that's the one idea I want to put out there. The second idea I want to put out there is Olson's argument about roving and stationary bandits. That's also a fantastic argument. And also Basel's argument, very similar, is that the state is a violent third-party enforcement mechanism. In the story that my good friend Jason Potts and I put out last year in the Cato Journal, we actually make an argument that intellectual property rights are not a gift from the government, are not a monopoly return, that intellectual property is created by the minds of human beings. Those human beings know that people are going to steal their property, and they make a deal with a stationary bandit to protect them from roving bandits. So you make a deal with the government because you know there are Vikings out there, and the Vikings are going to steal your stuff. And so in this particular story, intellectual property rights are a result of a bargain for protection in return for taxation, or taxation rights. So entrepreneurs create economic assets. They protect the value of their assets by seeking out the protection of a stationary bandit. This is not a rent-seeking story. This is not a crony capitalism story. The argument about IP, we argue, is not monopoly. It's actually taxation. Which means you cannot rely on international institutions which have got no taxing power to look after your property. So don't look to the United Nations, don't look to the World Trade Organization and all these places to look after your property. Look to your own government. And when this came out, Arnold Kling very nicely said, this theory suggests the country with the largest sector of copyable products will have the largest navy. The United States of America has the largest navy. Before the United States of America, Great Britain had the largest navy. That certainly is true. We're looking for other evidence as well, of course. But anyway, what I did here was I took the Intellectual Property Rights Index of the last 3 years, averaged it. I did this the day before the latest data came out, so it's not exactly up to date. And I took average IP receipts to GDP, and I just plotted the data. And what's very nice is that you see more or less a flat line until about 7. There's an outlier there, that's Chile. Flat line here until about 7. That's China, if I recall. Anyway, and then all of a sudden, after 7, massive jump. I said, well, okay, let's have a look at these countries. Who are these people? And these people here. And it turns out that the single largest exporter of IP in the world is the United States by an order of magnitude. Massive, massive, massive. Bearing in mind the United States itself is made up of 50 wealthy economies. So there's a size effect there anyway. But nonetheless, who are the largest beneficiaries of IP trade? An unsurprising list of countries. Ireland, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Singapore, and Switzerland. Okay, tax havens. All right, these guys are tax havens. There are other tax havens, they fell out of the data, but here are our tax havens. Okay, let's keep that in the back of our minds. The emergence of property rights. So this is Itai Senat's model. It's a political economy model. 4 conditions: the right must be valuable, right holders must desire the right, duty bearers must respect the right, rule makers must desire to enforce the right. And we can ask a whole bunch of questions about all of these things, but what happens when you live in a world where rule makers don't want to enforce your right? What happens then? Well, here's an example, a recent example from Australia, plain packaged tobacco. This is a Marlboro packet which started off in the 1980s looking something like that. In the 1990s looked something like that. In 2005 looked something like that. And in 2012, December, looked something like that. Let's be unequivocal, smoking causes lung cancer. You will probably die. Anyway, but compare that packet to this packet here. What has happened is that all the trademarks, all the branding is all gone. That is now, you can't see it too well in this picture, that is olive green. It's not allowed to be called olive green because the Olive Growers Association complained that they were being associated with tobacco products. So that is called drab brown. Okay, it's got a number. Anyway, so all packets of cigarettes in Australia have to be in drab brown. They have to have a warning. So smoking causes lung cancer. Smoking gives you small babies. That was a mistake. They've taken that one away because it turned out a lot of pregnant teenage girls started smoking in order to have a smaller baby. These were all tested beforehand to make sure that the proper messages were getting out. And the name of the brand, or the product, is in a standardized font, in a standardized size, in a standardized location. Okay, so what happened? Now, I'm not going to talk to you right now about all the work I've done on what a disaster this policy was in terms of efficacy. I want to talk to you about what happens when the government doesn't enforce property rights. And what happens is, first of all, non-price competition has replaced price competition replaced non-price competition. So, in actual fact, for many smokers, the price of cigarettes fell. And the other thing that's happened is we've had increased criminality. Okay, that is not surprising at all. So we now have the tax office and the government announcing more and more anti-tobacco crackdowns. Driving in the cab this morning here in Singapore, I saw the sign which said, it takes one cigarette for you to get a criminal record. Just one. Sorry, one illegal cigarette for you to get a criminal record. I mean, that is a massive, massive, massive over-enforcement of law. But so we have increased criminality. And of course, criminality, we know, is a gateway to further criminality. Criminals get up to all sorts of things that we don't like, or we might like at some margins, I suppose, but they don't do quality control. If you buy a legal cigarette, you know precisely what poisons you are putting into your body. They are not model employers, they don't pay taxes. That's not a bad thing, perhaps. They don't pay dividends. They don't promote sustainability, they engage in violence, they engage in terrorism, you smuggle drugs, you smuggle all sorts of other things too. What's happened in Australia is that smuggling cigarettes has become so profitable that people have substituted from smuggling harder drugs. Because the profit margins are higher on the cigarettes, and of course the prison terms and fines are lower on the cigarettes. Now, I suppose this is a saving at some sort of margin, but nonetheless, it's undesirable, unsociable activity. And then, of course, governments would rather harass otherwise law-abiding citizens and industries than actually engage in proper criminal or anti-criminal serious crimes. Okay. The domestic legal system in Australia and the United Kingdom has not been particularly effective in protecting intellectual property rights. In Australia, the High Court, which is our highest level court, actually said that yes, the government was taking the property rights away from the tobacco industry, but because they weren't planning to use it themselves, they didn't need to pay compensation. Now, if you think about that for a moment, if the government of Australia set fire to the High Court judge's house, they wouldn't be using it themselves either. And so they wouldn't need to pay compensation under that particular logic. So it's quite astonishing, that argument. The World Trade Organization, which met here in Singapore, actually looked at the empirical evidence up to 2015, walked past some very dodgy peer-reviewed studies, and actually settled on an even dodgier government report in Australia to say that, well, there's evidence that it worked. So let's have a look at some of that evidence. This is data from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey from the early 90s all the way down to 2016 when the last data came out. and you see a downward longward trend there, and that is mostly because of education policies. People now know smoking is bad for you. Smoking rates in Australia have been declining since the 1960s. Anyway, let's have a look. I don't know if I can do this fast enough, but here are all the policies that have come in. That's when plain packaging was introduced, and there were 12.5% excise increases, and another 4.5% have been announced already, and that's what happened. See that again? There we go. Flatlined. There is no statistical significant difference between smoking rates in 2016 than what they were in 2013. The first time that has ever happened that there's been a flatlining. And of course, given population growth, the number of smokers in Australia has actually increased. Okay, we've got more smokers today than what we did when the policy was introduced just over 5 years ago. Okay, so if we think about intellectual property rights, what has happened is the Australian government, which is a net, or Australia as a country is a net importer of IP, we have expropriated intellectual property rights, or the executive government expropriated the executive property rights, and the judiciary did nothing about it, leading to all these adverse consequences and bad news and what have you. But now think back to our countries, our tax havens. One of the easiest ways to steal IP is to tax to death. So you might produce your IP in the United States, leave your American IP in the States, but your international IP, you are going to move to a tax haven where it's not going to be taxed to death. So if you want to steal IP, what do you do next? Well, you come up with some rubbish story about stateless income. It's not fair that Australian companies have got hubs in Singapore where IP lives, and then they have to pay for IP rights to Singapore. It's wrong, it's immoral. They are avoiding taxation in Australia. And so we've seen a campaign out of the Australian government, of course, but out of the OEC generally speaking, talking about the negative externalities of tax competition, which then moved into this whole stateless income argument. But if you work through the stateless income argument, companies are paying the amount of tax legally required to be paid in Australia and paying the amount of tax legally required to be paid in Singapore under the laws the executive government in Australia made, under treaties the executive government in Australia signed. So there is no argument that there is actually stateless income. It's just there is income which the government of the United States or the European governments or the Australian governments would like to tax. And my question to these people always is, why do the owners of IP not locate their property in your economy? And the answer is, because you're a thief. You're going to steal it. So, conclusions. Technology is going to disrupt industrial society as we know it, massively, for good and for bad. When I go to Canberra and talk to them about blockchain, the first question the politicians ask is, can we build a backdoor? And you say, no. Human capital will come to dominate physical capital. IP and IP rights are going to become more important than what they are. Well-behaved and well-constrained stationary bandits will enhance economic activity. And those are the sorts of things Fred was talking about, rule of law, actual judicial systems that uphold the rule of law, free speech, all those things. And at the moment there seems to be a lot of roving banditry at the moment. I actually think the Westphalian state is dying. It's going to die a hard death, but it's going to be a good thing for human liberty. The other thing I haven't spoken about, but there's a lot of anti-business, anti-capitalist sentiment about at the moment. The way to think about that is Brian Kaplan's 4 biases. But the challenge for all of us is to make the economic, moral, and social arguments that will enhance and facilitate prosperity. There is one line in Mises' Human Capital that I completely disagree with, where he's talking about the market, and he says, you don't need to justify the market, you don't have to propagandize the market. It's like going to St. Paul's. What you do is you just look around you. Well, we can't look around us. We actually have to propagandize the benefits of capitalism. To find out more on plain packaging, please Google Sinclair Davidson plain packaging resources. There's a lot of stuff there where I talk about the evidence of the policy not working. Stateless income, please Google Sinclair Davidson stateless income. This is advertising, of course. There's no tip jars. Stationary bandit model, Google Sinclair Davidson stationary bandit Cato. And my stuff on blockchain, please Google crypto economics and Medium, and you'll find all my Medium posts and stuff there. So thank you very much. I've probably spoken way over time.